And the sons of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed from the Egyptians vessels of silver and vessels of gold and garments. Imagine for a moment the setting in which this scene took place. The children of Israel had been slaves and servants to the Egyptians for hundreds of years. They had recently witnessed the incredible stubbornness of Pharaoh, who repeatedly refused to let them go free. Even after all the horrible plagues that laid waste to his country, the Pharaoh still hardened his heart time after time. Now, finally, after the gruesome final plague had wiped out all of the firstborn males in Egypt, the children of Israel were about to be set free. And they were given an unexpected bonus under the Lord's guiding hand as they departed. They were told that they could borrow permanently from the Egyptians their gold, their silver, and their garments. What an unbelievable sense of joy and satisfaction this must have brought to them. Not only were they free from their captors, but they also could take with them whatever they wanted. How we develop our minds on a sound foundation of knowledge and truth is the subject this morning. What does this command from the Lord about borrowing from the Egyptians really mean? How does it apply in our everyday lives? Ask yourself, are you borrowing from the Egyptians right now? Now, at first glance, trying to answer these questions from the Word can be tricky. Twice before today's story, the Lord had instructed the children of Israel to borrow from the Egyptians. He even went so far as to say they should plunder the Egyptians. But then later in the book of Deuteronomy, the Lord frequently and specifically commands them not to borrow anything from the surrounding nations, saying, "For Jehovah your God will bless you just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall not covet the gold or the silver that is on them, nor take it for yourselves, lest it be a snare to you." These passages seem somewhat contradictory, and they beg the question, should we borrow from the Egyptians or should we not borrow? How are we to make sense of these commands that the Lord has given to us when they appear to be opposed to each other? First, let's start with the basics. Egypt, in the word, means the knowledges stored up in our memory. All the information, all the facts, all the natural truths, all the scientific data that we have learned and that we know. And it's very appropriate for Egypt to represent natural truths or the worldly knowledge. At the time of our story, Egypt was known as the center of knowledge in the world. They had miraculously constructed the Great Pyramids. Their hieroglyphics were an incredibly advanced form of language, and they also had some knowledge of correspondences between this world and the spiritual world. The vessels of gold and silver and the garments symbolize the various degrees of memory knowledges of good and truth that they were in possession of and that were being transferred from Egypt to the children of Israel for their use. The heavenly doctrine makes an important point about knowledges in the Arcana Celestia. It says, with the evil, the knowledges of good and truth are applied to evil uses. And with the good, the knowledges of good and truth are applied to good uses. The knowledges are the same, but the application to uses affects the quality with each person. So think about that. The knowledges, it says, are the same. In themselves, they are neither good nor evil, but they are recipients or vessels for what is good and evil. Take, for example, the simple knowledge of how to swing a hammer. Knowing how to swing a hammer is neither good nor evil. When that knowledge is used for building houses for the poor or building a temple of worship to the Lord, then that knowledge has become a vessel for receiving good, and it becomes an instrument for good. However, when that exact same knowledge of how to swing a hammer is used to break a neighbor's window so that we can steal their 75-inch TV, or to whack somebody on the head who we have a disagreement with, then that knowledge becomes a vessel for receiving evil and becomes an instrument for evil. Think of another example. Think of people who have a sound knowledge of finance and the stock market. They could use that knowledge to acquire wealth for the purpose of serving the Lord and the neighbor, or for the purpose of catering to their own selfish desires and greed. The knowledge itself of how to make money from the stock market is neither a good or an evil thing. It's how it is used. And so we're told in the heavenly doctrine, in that passage we read in our lessons, knowledges are a means of becoming wise, and they are also a means of becoming insane. And then it says they're a means of becoming insane when they're falsified by being applied to evils and falsities. The simple point that the Lord is trying to get across is that it is the purpose or the end for which knowledge is used that makes all the difference. And this explains why sometimes the Lord commanded them to borrow from the Egyptians, and sometimes he prohibited them from borrowing. If in the literal sense the Lord's commanding them to go to Egypt or to borrow vessels and gold and silver from Egypt, then it corresponds to learning, and it corresponds, the gold and the silver there, to learning those knowledges of good and truth that will be used for a good end. But if the Lord is prohibiting them from borrowing in the literal sense or from going down to Egypt, then the gold and silver there corresponds to a knowledge that will be used for an evil end or an evil purpose. And this gets to the heart of our text this morning. Here, we're specifically dealing with the command to borrow from the Egyptians. The acquiring of knowledge of natural truths is being used here in a positive way. And this is why in the book of Daniel, it says the Egyptians, the knowledges of the Egyptians are called desirable and good things. Think about it. The acquisition of knowledge is essential in our ability to understand the Lord's Word. We cannot understand the parable of the mustard seed if we don't know what a seed is. We can't understand the meaning of the Lord saying, giving rain in due season, if we've never learned about the rain, if we've never learned what seasons are. We can't understand what the Lord means when it says He opens His hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing if we've never experienced a harvest and how the Lord provides for us. Think about it. This is why Swedenborg was guided by the Lord to gain an unbelievably large amount of knowledge about the things of this world, about science, and about nature. How could Swedenborg have had any real comprehension of heaven being in the form of and functioning as a grand man if he had not first studied anatomy and physiology and had some framework with which to put that into? How could he have written about the correspondences of natural things with spiritual things if he had absolutely no knowledge of science and nature? Yes, you could say that the Lord commanded Swedenborg to borrow from the Egyptians, and he was one who borrowed a lot. You could even say he spent his life plundering them. But just gaining knowledge for the sake of gaining knowledge is not useful in itself. Why is it the Lord wants us to gain knowledge? It's so that we can understand His Word and learn the way to heaven and be able to dwell happily with Him to eternity. The Lord commanded the children of Israel to borrow the gold, the silver, and the garments from the Egyptians for the purpose of leaving Egypt. They were not supposed to remain there. They were supposed to leave Egypt with haste. The gold, the silver, and the garments were there to provide the means for them to get where? To get to Canaan, to get to heaven. It is the same with each one of us. The purpose of acquiring knowledge is not so that we can remain in our natural worldly states, or so that we can glory in our own self-intelligence. The purpose of us gaining knowledge is so that we can see the Lord in all the details of His creation, to better understand His Word when we read it, and to learn the way to heaven, and to live a life according to the truth that it teaches. So where do we go in this day and age to get those knowledges? The heavenly doctrine tells it quite plainly what we should do. It says the fountains of truth are two, one from the Word, the other from nature or the truths of nature. The foundation from the Word is for the universal heaven, but the foundation from nature for all those who are natural. But still, these two foundations of truth agree with one another. Therefore, since sciences have shut up the understanding, sciences may also open it. And the understanding is opened so far as people are in good. So think about that. Two foundations, two sources from which we can acquire knowledge. Nature, all the sciences of the world, this is Egypt. And the Word of God. Now, which do you think is more important? Of course, the answer is easy. In the family service, the kids immediately got, of course, the Word is more important. And in fact, the kids were right. The heavenly doctrine says this point blank. The Word is greater than any doctrinal teachings in the world and greater than any truth in the world. And so in Isaiah, the Lord tells us, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek Jehovah. For Egypt is man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. It is easy to say that the Word is obviously the more important and accurate source of truth and knowledge. But do our actions always demonstrate this fact? For instance, if you read one of those old marriage books, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, do you take those wonderful insights and then fit it into the context of what the Lord teaches in His Word, or do you find yourself trying to fit little nuggets from the Word into the framework of that secular book? If you delight in science, do you place the various scientific theories into the construct provided by the Lord in His Word? Or do you begin to stuff from the Word into the scientific theories of the day? What about education? if you enjoy the field of education, do you view the various educational theories in the light of the Word, or do you view the Word in the light of the latest, greatest theories? And so on. You could say this about any subject. The point is that the Word should always be the measuring stick against which all other truth and knowledge is measured. This is what ultimately will lead to wisdom. And so the one reading we had tells us the importance of starting with that affirmative principle towards the Word, and to believe the truths within. Why? It says simply because the Lord has said them. Then, with that attitude, all the knowledges that we have acquired from the world, everything that we have borrowed from the Egyptians over our lifetime, can be used to confirm, illustrate, and enhance our understanding of the Lord's Word. This is the true path to wisdom, which will help us to see ever more clearly the way we're supposed to go, the way that leads to heaven, and the life of good that we're supposed to be living. But if we start with a negative or a skeptical attitude towards the Lord's Word and say we're only going to be convinced of that truth once it's confirmed by science or by the facts of nature, then, bit by bit, we gradually begin to harden our hearts against what the Lord teaches in His Word, and ultimately, it says we'll end up denying God and put nature as our God instead. This concept was actually perfectly illustrated in the story we read about the children of Israel. After they had borrowed all that gold and silver and the garments from the Egyptians, they headed off towards Canaan. But along the way, we find out they actually longed for the things of Egypt. Even after the Lord gave them the heavenly manna, they still longed for the flesh pots of Egypt. And so when Moses went up to receive the 10 Commandments from God Himself, what did the children of Israel do? They instead took the knowledge they had, they took the gold that was with them that they had brought from Egypt, and they melted it down, and they erected a golden calf instead. They treasured the worldly knowledge above the truth of the Word, and so they ended up in that story denying Jehovah as their God. But also remember that after Moses came down from the mountain, they, at least externally, we're told, repented of their evils, and they took the gold that they had brought from Egypt, and they used it under the Lord's command to make the ark, which served as the vessel for receiving the very 10 Commandments of God. And it was this same ark with those 10 Commandments within them that later parted the Jordan River and led them into the heavenly land of Canaan. You see, the worldly knowledges or the natural truths, when kept in their proper place, become appropriate vessels for receiving the truth and the good of the Lord's Word. And these are what eventually will guide you to heaven. So, yes, the Lord does ask us to borrow from the Egyptians, even telling us to plunder them. He wants us to soak up all kinds of knowledge, science, history, geology, astronomy, carpentry, philosophy, education, music, and the list can go on and on. He wants us to learn all those things because He knows that they can help to beautifully confirm, strengthen, and enhance our understanding of His Word, and consequently our faith and our belief in the Lord. However, along the way, He does warn us that the acquisition of knowledge is not an end in itself. This is the meaning behind the teaching of building our house upon the rock. Notice this story was the conclusion of his famous Sermon on the Mount, where the Lord conveyed an immense amount of divine truth, gave them so much knowledge, which provided that sound foundation upon which they should build their lives. But the conclusion of his sermon was that a wise person must not only hear those words of his, they had to do them. The pursuit of knowledge is meant to be the way that we obtain all those vessels of truth and good from the Lord, and to ultimately build our faith soundly on that rock-solid foundation of the truth which comes primarily from His Word. If we prize the knowledge of this world more than the truth of His Word, and merely are content with learning the truth but not living it, then we will stay forever captive in Egypt, constantly building our fragile faith on the shifting sands of human reason from merely worldly knowledge. And so the Lord told us in that story, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house upon the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does them not shall be likened to a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. Amen.